Welcome to the Sanctions Age, the podcast that explores how sanctions are changing the world. My name is Isvander Batmangelic. Few companies better embody the promise and peril of China's rise than Huawei. For 3 decades, Huawei has steadily climbed towards the peak of the global telecommunications industry, first as a supplier of telecom infrastructure, then as a maker of smartphones, and more recently as a driving force behind Chinese ambitions in 5G, semiconductors, and artificial intelligence. Huawei's ascent has also made it a prime target of US sanctions, export controls, and political pressure. Since the early 2000s, Huawei has faced repeated confrontations with American economic power, from losing access to markets in Iran and Iraq, to getting shut out of 3 and 4G buildouts in the US and Europe, to becoming a central focus of the Trump-era trade war with China. On today's episode, we will be discussing Huawei with a reporter who knows the company best. Eva Doe is a tech policy reporter at The Washington Post. Prior to joining the Post, Eva spent 7 years reporting on politics and technology for the Wall Street Journal in Beijing and Taipei. Earlier this year, she published House of Huawei, a deeply reported account of the rise of China's most successful technology company and its enigmatic founder, Ren Zhongfei. House of Huawei has been shortlisted for the Financial Times Business Book of the Year. Eva, welcome to the show.
So great to be here.
So, Eva, I'd like to start by asking a question about your decision to write House of Huawei. I mean, these days there's a book coming out every week, it seems, on China and China's rise and policy questions around China. But very few of these books tend to be focused on a specific company or even a specific person. What made you decide to write a book about Huawei specifically rather than maybe a more general reflection of where China is today? And what do you think your book offers in terms of insights about China that maybe other books don't?
As a journalist, I think I've been sort of trained to see n- broad issues through the lens of individual people and individual stories. And I think just the way the human brain works, this is how we best understand complicated topics large amounts of information, complicated stories, when it's filtered through the lens of a single person's journey, that narrative arc. Helps us understand the complexities of the world that we live in. And so, as sort of Donald Trump's first presidency was unfolding with, the trade war, with these export controls and these very complicated technical topics, I felt that uh, sort of this extraordinary story of Huawei's founder was a great way to embody it in a single person.
That was definitely my takeaway as a reader. I thought it was really, it made it much easier to understand kind of the scope of what had happened and the transformations that had taken place in China um, by learning about this one individual and the company that he founded. And before we dive into kind of the implications of Huawei's rise, I mean, obviously it would be very helpful maybe for the listeners to have some background on the company. So I wonder, Eva, if you can maybe give us a short introduction on who is Ren Zhongfei and what was his sort of mindset when he was founding Huawei and the general kind of arc of the company's development in the past 30 years. I mean, what kind of company was Huawei in 1987 when it was founded, and what kind of company is it today?
So Huawei today is one of China's premier technological powerhouses. It's sort of made its name by becoming the leading vendor of telecommunications equipment in the world, which these are sort of the pipes that make up internet networks, that make up phone networks. But since then, it's sort of evolved beyond that. It now is also the maker of the leading AI chips in China. It's into robotics. It's into electric vehicles. It really is a key part of sort of the future of China's tech industry. And so this company started in 1987 very humbly. It was sort of a contract manufacturer of very basic telephone switches, these sort of boxes that were not the major switching centers of a city's telephone network, but sort of the very small nodes that would be in maybe a hotel or an individual business would have one of these that you could plug multiple telephone lines into. The founder, Ren Zhengfei, was born in 1944. And so his life journey really sort of traverses modern China's story. He was born um, during the tumultuous years of China's civil war. He the first half of his career was in China's military as an engineer, and he sort of made the switch to the private sector um, when Deng Xiaoping was sort of transforming China's economy as one being strictly state controlled to sort of introducing and experimenting with these elements of capitalism. And so, he was in the first wave in Shenzhen, which was a city where they were beginning this experiment of capitalism in China. And Huawei was one of the first companies that these first private tech companies that was set up sort of on a trial basis at that point. Yeah, a major transformation, sort of an unlikely story of the rise of a powerhouse.
There were, as you've described, lots of companies kind of getting set up in Shenzhen in that very active late 1980s period. But in order to kind of introduce the idea that Ren Zhongfei was a somewhat unusual entrepreneur, you start your book with two epigraphs. One is from Admiral William Owens, who was the former vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And he said, "As a military man, I have known many clever and truly outstanding strategists. I have rarely come across an individual more strategically oriented than Ren." And there's a second epigraph that you also introduce early in the book, which is a quote from Ren himself, where back in 1994, he stated, "A country without its own program-controlled switches is like one without an army." And I think the intention here was to sort of introduce that, Ren was starting a company, a telecommunications company. There were a lot of people starting technology companies at that moment, but you have this individual who clearly was a strategic thinker and also seemed to understand the national security significance of the technology he was working with, even at a time when, as you say, they were producing pretty basic switch boxes that might be in a hotel or in a business that needed a lot of phone lines. What was it about Ren's strategic outlook that you think kind of set a course for Huawei and its development? And was he really different than other entrepreneurs setting up businesses in the late 1980s in China?
I think part of Huawei's success, a part of its survival and success has been Ren's sort of keen understanding of international politics and sort of the role of China in that, which is changing from decade to decade, and sort of Huawei's role as an individual company in that. And so you see that in uh, comments like that he made, that a nation without its own telephone switches is like one without an army, which was something he said very early on before Huawei was a company people were taking seriously at all. And it showed that sort of long before they were in the crosshairs of the Trump administration, they sort of understood um, sort of the political significance of technology and technology companies. And this, I guess, makes them a more interesting company in some ways than sort of the common thing that I've been known about them in the US was these IP cases, sort of this complaint and allegation that Huawei had stolen IP and had sort of imitated rivals. And so um, I think that part of it has been sort of it looking at its rivals and catching up quickly in all sorts of ways. But what makes it a more formidable rival really is this sort of strategic planning of the company and its understanding of how politics and business intersect.
I think it's easy to forget that it was once a very small company and a kind of an upstart in a difficult industry and that no one expected it to succeed. But that's something that you paint very clearly in the book. And you describe how in the early sort of 1990s, when the company had finally started producing telephone switches that were reasonably good and could be used in a variety of applications, they tried to start exporting those products beyond China. And at the time, they were competing with the big dogs of the telecommunications industry, companies like Marconi or Siemens or Fujitsu, Nokia, and of course, Motorola and Cisco. And obviously, they couldn't go head to head with those companies in the main markets. They just couldn't compete. And so they ended up finding, as you describe, a kind of niche working with rogue states. So you write about how Huawei moved quite sort of aggressively into Iraq in the early 1990s while Iraq was under a UN embargo following the Gulf War. You also note that in 1996, Russia and China signed a strategic partnership which opened the door for Chinese firms to move into Russia, and Huawei was really at the front of the line there. It seems to me that these experiences, kind of in this early stage of the company's development, also shaped the mindset of Huawei executives and especially Ren. I mean, what was it about kind of the presence of the company in these places that, from the standpoint of the US, were rogue states that gave a particular outlook to Huawei? And maybe you could also touch on an episode you write about in the book, which is this really significant bombing of a Chinese embassy in 1998 in Belgrade.
Certainly. So, sort of the broad story of China in on the international stage in the 1990s was a country trying to gain acceptance and trying to become part of the international community and sort of being rejected by the United States and its allies repeatedly. So, China was trying to join the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which um, it tried for many, many years, and it wasn't until the early 2000s that it was finally let in. But so much of this, what you see for Huawei's story and many Chinese company stories, is against that backdrop where China was pushing its companies to go out into the world and to internationalize, to not be just Chinese companies, but international companies. And with the expectation that once China enters the WTO, there'll be an influx of competition from the world into China. And there was an enormous amount of uncertainty and fear among Chinese companies, including Huawei, of whether they'd be able to survive that. Kind of a similar dynamic as we're seeing right now, which is both US and Chinese companies uncertain if they're going to survive sort of the international economic order being reshaped. Um, and so that was the case at the time too. And I think for companies like Huawei, they really felt um, that internationalizing was imperative to survive, that they needed to get a foothold overseas before these foreign firms that were way stronger than them, Cisco, Nokia, before they flooded to the China market full force. And so in the early days, as you mentioned, Huawei, sort of for major markets, the United States, much of Europe, Huawei had a lot of difficulty even getting its foot in the door, partly because it was a Chinese company and partly just because it was sort of a new company and people didn't trust it that it would could make gear that was good and that it would be able to survive. So it was partly due to that Huawei began operating in countries that were under US sanctions. Those were the countries that were willing to work with Huawei and also that were seeking support from China's government at the same time. And so this became a double-edged sword for Huawei. It helped it sort of internationalize in those first years, but also became a reason, the reason that the US government cracked down on it.
And because they were getting kind of shut out from, let's say, the Western markets that they wanted to be big players in, and also because they ended up working in places where sort of the presence of US or let's say UN sanctions complicated their business activities. I mean, I got the sense reading this section of the book that there was a little bit almost of resentment that was developing about this unwillingness on the part of some of the major telecommunications players and also foreign governments, Western governments, to take Huawei seriously. But there was this, again, this sort of specific episode, which was the reaction to the bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. And it was striking for me that a geopolitical event like that would really have, at least in your recounting, like a strong kind of ripple effect or a strong impact on the thinking within Huawei among Huawei executives, that a lot of them had a very personal reaction to this when they saw that the US bombed this embassy in Belgrade, leading to a loss of life. It was an accident, according to the US, but there was skepticism about that explanation, or at least a frustration about the level of contrition on the part of the Americans over the event. What was the significance of that episode in 1998, and did it actually cast the shadow in terms of Huawei's thinking in the subsequent sort of decade and a half?
Yes, certainly. So Huawei has this internal newspaper called Huawei People that they put out regularly, and this was one of the sort of international events that they actually spent um, a lot of focus on in its internal newspaper, with people writing essays about how they felt about it. And so this incident, it looms large in sort of the Chinese people's psyche, even to the present day, in a way that it definitely doesn't for Americans. So for the bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, the U.S. said it was an accident. They didn't mean to do it. In China, it was largely people didn't believe that. They felt that it was sort of a cover up, and so that sense that the U.S. government was not their friend and could not be trusted, despite sort of the warming ties of globalization, I think that that very much has lingered, and even today, you see people in China's tech industry and more broadly in society sort of reference that incident as a reminder that they have to be wary of the United States.
And I guess this leads into some of the other strategic decisions that were being made. I mean, I became aware of Huawei, I guess, in the sort of around 2008, 2009, when I started sort of reading more and working more on Iran and on its economy and on the effects of sanctions. And that's around the time where there was more scrutiny on the presence of Huawei in the Iranian market. And this is an episode that you also write about in the book, the presence of Huawei in Iran in that period when, as a result of multilateral sanctions being imposed on Iran related to its nuclear program, Western companies were pulling out of the country. But this kind of created an opening for Huawei to actually be that supplier of last resort and to help prop up the Iranian telecommunications industry. What's interesting for me is that they made the decision to continue to be in the Iranian market even as these sanctions and compliance risks mounted, and even in the face of more scrutiny from, let's say, regulators in the US about their presence. There seems to have been this kind of willingness to accept a lot of that risk because in some ways they thought it was worth it for them. I'm sure part of that motivation was financial. Iran was a large market. They could probably make a lot of money. But I'm curious to know, going back to kind of Ren's strategic thinking, for a lot of executives, and in fact, most executives, when you're faced with this question of, well, sanctions are being imposed on a country, should you pull out? Most of them strategically would say, yes, we're going to pull out. It's not worth the risk. And in some ways, Huawei made a different decision, at least for a significant period of time. And that ultimately set the stage for what would come next. I mean, what do you make of the sort of decision there to be in a market like Iran in that period. And what does that tell us a little bit about maybe Ren's worldview, at least with regards to this kind of growing specter of U.S. sanctions in the mid 2000s?
Yeah, Huawei's judgment on this was right up until it turned out that they were wrong, and that the US government's position changed dramatically. Um, in that for many years, this was the kind of issue that the US kind of turned a blind eye to a lot of the time, and Huawei sort of made what at the time was the correct judgment, that it could just get away with it, that this was the kind of thing that no one was really going to make an issue over. Um, and they weren't the only one in the market either. And I think that sense of everyone's doing it, and no one really cares, was definitely a part of it. And so when you look at the case that the first Trump administration brought against Huawei, for sanctions violations in Iran. These were actions from a decade ago, from many years ago, that the US government hadn't pursued immediately, and was only sort of quite belatedly becoming an issue. And so this was, I think they did not predict that this sentiment shift was going to happen, which was partly predicated on the company, its growing strength, it getting to another level. It wasn't just, a low end competitor, uh, out there in the market. It was actually number one now, and sort of um, seen as a major threat to the U.S. government.
And I think that the prosecution that you just mentioned that the Trump administration undertook using the sort of allegation of Iran sanctions violations as kind of the main hook, that is kind of the key story in the book in some ways. So in 2018, Meng Wanzhou, who was at the time Huawei's CFO, she is also Ren Zhengfei's daughter and had sort of, as you recount, made this sort of unexpected rise through the ranks of the company to become CFO. She is arrested in Canada and in Vancouver, if I recall correctly. And basically there was an extradition request from the US, and they end up pursuing this prosecution. And the grounds are that she had misled um, basically banks about the extent of Huawei's activities in Iran, and that they had deliberately obfuscated the company's business in the country in violation of US secondary sanctions and primary sanctions. Um, Now, obviously, this triggered a big international firestorm because she was a very high profile executive, and the Trump administration had made this dramatic move to arrest her. But it also seemed to become a symbol that top leadership at Chinese companies were, in a way, vulnerable or could be held accountable from the US perspective for some of these decisions. So, that judgment that you described, that Huawei could get away with it, in 2018, it seemed like suddenly they couldn't get away with it. How did that event, uh, do you feel like, how did it sort of change the perception of the stakes around Huawei's pursuit of developing as a company, and, you know, how much space they were going to be provided by the US to continue to grow before the US was, set to take more dramatic action?
The detention of Meng Wanzhou had a major, major effect in China for both, how the leadership and for private industry, how they sort of considered the United States and what their approach needed to be. And that um, it it is quite unusual to detain an executive like this for in this kind of case. And this made people in China feel that the rules of the game had changed, that, the gloves are off now, that sort of anything could go from the United States. And this would mean, a lot more risks that they hadn't envisioned before. There were sort of two major shocks to China. The first one was ZTE, export controls being put against ZTE, which that was the first one before Huawei. And that was sort of the first time that China sort of saw how vulnerable they were, how vulnerable their supply chains were to the United States. That due to political whims, and the political leader changing and what they wanted to do, suddenly one of China's national champions could be sort of strangled to death in a matter of months. So that was the first sort of shock, and then the second shock was Mo Wanzhou's detention, which, this is not just a financial matter and matter of like businesses and enterprises. This is sort of people. It's personal that, and for from the U.S. they saw it as a lawful detention of a criminal suspect. From China's side, they saw it as hostage taking, and there was enormous indignation. And sort of it, this surge of patriotism in the country of how to respond.
I think it's funny because in some ways it's very easy to forget that that whole arrest of Meng Wanzhou even happened. I mean, it feels like it was a lifetime ago, even though it was less than a decade ago. But it seemed to be a turning point, and it does come across as a turning point in the narrative of the book. But you just mentioned the export controls, which I think are the other action that has become maybe a more persistent feature of U.S. policy, because the Trump administration, as you described, imposed these export controls on ZTE, which was sort of Huawei's the other big player in the telecommunications space from China. So Huawei and ZTE were often benchmarking against one another. And then I believe that subsequently in 2019, Huawei was also added to the entities list by the US Department of Commerce. So it also became subject to similar export controls. And this is a year after the arrest of the CFO. So these problems seem to be compounding. What was it about the export controls specifically? I mean, you mentioned this idea of the vulnerability of the supply chain, but Ren Zhongfei was an executive that seemed to have an awareness of these things from a very early point. I mean, he was talking about China's ability to control its own telecommunications infrastructure as being a major priority for national security, comparing it to something like having its own army, a country having an army. Was this really something that came out of left field and surprised them? And, do you think that they felt at the time, looking back in 2018, that they would be able to adapt, or was there really a moment of almost existential concern for the company?
I think for a couple years there, it very much was an existential concern, in that uh, these some of these core technologies, sort of the chips and the complicated software involved in the supply chains of making electronics, they're not things that a country can sort of rebuild overnight, even if it has the resources of the entire nation, sort of focused on it. And it was uh, yeah, uncertain if Huawei was going to be able to continue making its products and filling those holes. I think what made this some surprising to them, what they didn't expect, is that the United States would be willing to sort of suffer the costs on its end of sort of a painful technological war like this, which um, we're sort of seeing replay again in the second Trump administration. Like the most recently, China's put out these broad threats to choke off the U.S. supply of rare earth materials. So there's this mutual dependency. It's not only the U.S. that can threaten China to turn off the lights for China's industry. China can also do the same. And until quite recently, it would have seemed crazy to think that either country would be willing to risk that and to sort of cut off its nose to spite its face. Um, so I think it has been sort of a gradual adjustment on both sides where they sort of see the need to build their own supply chains to that the other side cannot be a reliable partner, means that they have to suffer some of these economic costs.
I think that's the part that is sort of surprising to me looking back, which is that you keep imagining that at some point there would be such a dramatic escalation that both sides would realize that this is, moving towards this zero sum competition is going to be ruinous, and that it's better if they try and avoid it. And in some ways, looking back to this period, especially around 2018, 2019, in the first Trump term, you think that those were events that were consequential enough and worrying enough that it would have led both sides to realize that maybe they need to move away from this kind of confrontation. And Meng Wanzhou was released in 2021 as part of a deferred prosecution agreement. And it seemed to me that that could have been a good moment for there to be a little bit of, an attempt to make up, and especially for Huawei to go a bit on the charm offensive and try and sort of rebuild trust with stakeholders in the West about the company's intentions and its relationship to the Chinese state and all these things that had come up as concerns in that period when the prosecution was ongoing and when the export controls were being tightened. But that's not exactly what happens. And even during the Biden administration, where there was an effort maybe to manage the China US relationship, there's still an instinct among senior Biden officials that the rise of a company like Huawei is a threat to the US fundamentally. And so things like export controls are very necessary to try and keep, in sort of Jake Sullivan's terms, to maintain the lead over China. Why do you think we didn't see a reaction to the tensions around 2018, 2019, where the two countries decide that actually they're going to try and, find a new understanding, and why didn't companies like Huawei maybe more actively try and mobilize to get on a different trajectory where they weren't sort of becoming a pawn in this geopolitical conflict?
I think it reflects sort of a view from both governments that advanced technologies are just so core to a nation's strength, to a nation's sovereignty, and to sort of its influence in the world. That you see sort of this bipartisan concern in the United States um, that a company like Huawei, that China's surpassing the US in technology is an existential threat to the United States. That and there's a, I think it's unclear if that's the case, but there's a case to be made in that a country's military strength and a country's intelligence uh, community strength both rely on its cutting edge technologies. So it's been one area that there's been sort of an unusual level of consensus um, between Democrats and Republicans is the need to stay ahead of China for the most advanced generation of technologies, which right now is AI. Um, I think when you talk about um, sort of why they didn't back off. Both sides didn't sort of back off. I think what's kind of interesting is we're at that moment right now. We're actually at that key decisive moment where sort of China has put its cards on the table sort of more strongly than ever before. That if we're going to fight over supply chains, this is what we're going to do. We're going to shut off the lights for your industry. And so the Trump administration, they have a big decision to make. Do do they react entirely in kind, or is there some sort of negotiation where a de-escalation is possible, where both sides have shown their hands and both sides decide that sort of the costs of this are not what they want. And it's still kind of unclear how it's going to go. You see from Trump's messaging and from his administration, it's going back and forth. So they're undecided. He's saying both that the meeting's off with Xi and that he might still meet with him. So the door's still open for negotiations.
I hate that we're just waiting for posts on Truth Social to tell us, which way the administration is going to head on this question of whether they will retaliate. Um, I mean, it's interesting that we have gotten to this point, though, because I suppose, you described how the original export controls from the standpoint of companies like ZTE or Huawei were seen as basically an existential threat. And now we have a moment where Chinese authorities feel confident enough that they're willing to put all their cards on the table and weaponize the supply chain in the other direction, knowing that the U.S. can go to a much higher level with its tariffs and much more sort of be much more aggressive about export controls. I suppose some of that might be explained by the fact that in the intervening sort of 7 years since the export control started in the first Trump term, Chinese companies have shown an ability to adapt, especially these big strategic players like Huawei. And in the book, you write about the fact that in, for example, 2023, Huawei unveiled a phone which had a Chinese made chip, and it was kind of this revelation because, at least at the time, many people, including officials in the Biden administration, did not expect that the Chinese were so close to that kind of breakthrough. And subsequently, we've seen other examples of surprising breakthroughs. I mean, more recently, earlier this year, the launch of DeepSeek as a LLM that competes effectively with what ChatGPT and other companies are putting out. Do you think that that's part of a feedback loop here, where the uh, what looks like the ability of Chinese companies to adapt to this external pressure in the form of, let's say, export controls or sanctions is giving Chinese authorities more confidence that they can actually kind of go toe to toe with the US when it comes to this kind of economic coercion? And does that in some ways explain the instinct on the part of someone like Ren to, rather than go on a charm offensive to get the US off his back, in a sense, he sort of saw that there was no getting the US off his back, and instead what he was going to do is try and figure out a way of making sure that Huawei doesn't just not collapse, but figures out some innovations that actually give China resilience in the face of US pressure.
Part of what you see, China sort of showing its hand more fully now reflects that it feels it's had success with companies like Huawei and SMIC and DeepSeek in building some of these technologies that it lacked in a short amount of time. And that's given it more confidence. And some people might argue overconfidence. I think part of the asymmetry here is um, China China does not feel the need to sort of surpass the United States in the short term and to become number one. So in a way, just sort of surviving the way at its current level or even a bit lower is sort of satisfactory for it. Whereas for the United States, it would feel sort of disastrous in an existential way to lose the lead and to no longer be number one. And so, in a way, this is kind of an easier challenge for China to face in that companies like Huawei, their international growth has definitely been blunted by the US controls. And it's used to be growing in a straight line upward year on year, and it no longer is. But it's surviving, and that's sort of good enough for the company and good enough for China's leaders.
Well, that's actually one of the questions I wanted to get to, which is that you do describe in the book that you write the US government has succeeded in halting Huawei's rise. And, if you look at sort of the sales figures and you look at the expansion and maybe even the pace of innovation, I mean, we have to imagine what is the counterfactual. Would Huawei be innovating more quickly or less quickly were there not export controls and other forms of pressure imposed over the last sort of 7, 8 years? But on an earlier episode of the podcast, I had Kyle Chan on, and we talked a little bit about this phenomenon that maybe, or this pattern that you can kind of observe where Chinese executives seem to be acknowledging that someone is trying to um, throw sticks in their way or throw a wrench in the gears or create barriers for their development. And the response, at least in a number of companies and for a number of high profile executives, has been that they've really tried to double down on the pace of innovation and the growth. And it raises the question of whether, actually, somewhat counterintuitively, the US approach of trying to pressure these companies might actually be spurring them to become more aggressive about innovating. Because I take your point that primacy is maybe less like politically or sort of culturally important for China at this precise moment than it has been for the US. Like if the US is no longer number one, then that's a disaster for everyone, for the whole political class in the United States. That would not go down well in Washington. Beijing might be willing to bide its time, but I'm curious whether you think a company like Huawei at a more specific company level, or even for Ren Zhongfei as an individual, is he content to stay number two? And if someone is, in a sense, and if someone is deliberately trying to make sure he doesn't become number one, does that actually motivate him and his other senior executives that have grown up sort of in his mold? Does that actually end up motivating them more than it otherwise would have been the case?
Yeah. I think one thing we've seen culturally from Huawei over the years is um, Ren Zhengfei very much has had this philosophy that being low key and sort of humble is part of the key to success. Right now, at a time with so much international scrutiny on the company, I think probably the instinct of executives would be to downplay their successes and downplay their ambitions, at least for the near term, because they sort of understand that the more they succeed, the more they'll be seen as a threat by the United States and its allies. So that's one thing. The other thing is I think they do face very real challenges for continuing to innovate. I think um, one thing to keep in mind is that sort of before in the lead up to the 5G generation, which was their real breakout, they were tapping the global brain trust as far as their R&D talent, and not only in China. Like you didn't have to move to China to become part of Huawei. They had R&D centers all around the globe, including across Europe, across the in Canada. They had research partnerships with leading universities around the world. And so in recent years, a lot of that's been cut off, those university partnerships. And so I think there's a lagging effect. The innovation timeline for many of these technologies is like a decade or longer. So I think they face a very real challenge of no longer being able to tap the global brain trust for their next generation of innovation, and sort of having to rely more heavily just on Chinese engineers. And there is the countervailing force that sort of the patriotism and national indignation in China has sort of spurred a lot of Chinese engineers to feel really motivated to working towards this cause. And we'll have to sort of see how it shakes out.
Yeah, that's a really good point, that the kind of the time frames for generating some of this telecommunications infrastructure technology is very long, so we won't know for a while whether or not that this has had a decisive effect. But I want to kind of, as we move towards the end of the conversation, I want to go to, in a sense, the central question in the book that you are sort of exploring as you tell the story of Huawei's rise, which is this tension or this question about whether Huawei is a private company or whether it is essentially an arm of the Chinese state. And what's been clear, and especially as we've talked about it today, is that, in many respects at this point, Western governments are treating Huawei as basically inextricably linked with the Chinese state, as an arm of the state, as part of, even in some sense, the Chinese intelligence apparatus. And I'm curious to know whether, you think that that is now basically a permanent condition of how Huawei will be understood. And the parallel I might draw is that, as someone who grew up outside Washington, D.C., it's the idea that you have companies that are very closely linked to the state is no, is seems very normal, even though we don't often associate that with something as being fundamental to, let's say, the US economic model. But I can think of companies like Palantir or Raytheon or any number of the defense contractors that are, in a sense, private companies. They may be traded publicly, but they are very much beholden to the US defense industrial base and priorities of US national security. Do you think that's a fair comparison to draw? I mean, is Huawei now best understood not as a upstart private telecommunications company, but basically as a kind of quasi defense contractor in China? And and even if that were the case, is it that do you feel that fundamentally this kind of company in a Chinese context is different than, let's say, the likes of Palantir, which may have strong links to the US government and very much connected to priorities in US agencies, but nonetheless are not, can't be equated to a company like Huawei?
From the view of Beijing, they see a company like Huawei as sort of inextricably linked to the goals of the nation and the future success of the nation. I think during the 1990s, there was sort of this period where everyone was still figuring out what the model would be. And I think private companies in China had much more free reign during that time. That was the period where Huawei's executives were sort of figuring out their what their relationship to the state was, and this was something that they talked about in meetings. It was something they wrote about, where it was an open question for a while. Just what is the relationship between the party and the state and a private enterprise? Um, and I think by now, sort of not only in China, but also increasingly in the United States, we're seeing sort of governmental leaders sort of view technology companies as so core to a nation's interests that they can't be allowed to just sort of do what they want, up to and including the U.S. government taking the largest stake in Intel Corporation recently, which the kind of thing that would have been unthinkable a few years ago. But it very much maps over how China has been thinking about its companies. And I think sort of what a major difference would be is that China's policy remains more stable over time. They have these 5-year plans that they sort of follow pretty to the letter. And they don't have policy whiplash every 4 years from a presidential election. And so I think what you see is sort of a much broader and deeper sort of industrial policy to as far as supporting companies like Huawei and sort of the understanding of what their role is in the national economy.
Back to that idea of sort of strategic thinking and a long-term outlook. And I guess that is ultimately what makes maybe Huawei emblematic, because the company was able to engineer a rise, at least to a certain point, over the last 3 decades. Eva, it's time for me to ask the question that I ask each guest on the show. When did you realize that sanctions are changing the world?
So Huawei's launch of its new phone running a Chinese chip 2 years ago, I think that was a watershed moment for a lot of people, and also for me. And thinking just, hey, this is real. It's not just theoretical that, these supply chains could change because of sanctions. It's actually happening. Like people had talked about the US and China technology industries decoupling, sort of in quite a skeptical way for many years. But this was sort of a key event of this actually happening that Huawei could produce a phone despite the US sanctions with its own parts, with domestically made parts.
We'll have to see, if they can continue to innovate given the barriers that are being placed in their way. Eva, thank you so much for taking the time to join the show, and congratulations again on writing what is a phenomenal book and I think a really unique way of understanding China's rise in the last few decades and also this very kind of perilous moment that we're at with regards to China US competition.
Thank you so much for having me here. Really enjoyed the conversation.
I'm Esfander Batmanghelidj, and this has been The Sanctions Age. Our show is produced by Spiritland Productions. Thanks for listening.